Welcome everybody to the fourth session of the Do More with Your Farmland webinar series that we are putting on the Land Connections Illinois Farmling program. I'm Nathan Alberg. So glad you are here. Just as real simple background to this series, we've just been aware over the last number of years that there's a lot of people who own farmland, who don't farm it themselves, who really want to do more with it in ways that fit their values, give them the income that they need, and help them build a legacy that they want. And for example, this is a landowner conference that Extension put on back in 2023 in the Peoria area. And I was there, it was sold out. And there were so many people there who wanted to learn more about how to take care of their soil, how to have wildlife, all those kinds of things. And we just want to contribute to that knowledge in the state and around the country because we think it's really important for the happiness of farmland owners and for the kind of farming and land management that we have around the country. The other thing we just like to highlight is the fact that it's possible for a landowner and a farmer to have a really great relationship that's productive, profitable, but also a lot of fun and really rewarding in terms of the response that you can get from the land. Harry Drucker is a landowner. He's on the left, and Nathan Keatzer is his farmer tenant on the right. You can just see that they're enjoying doing what they're doing, working together, understanding how the land is responding. We're hoping to make this more possible for more people. As we get going, I just want to highlight the fact that we may have a few people today who are joining us for the first time, who maybe haven't used Zoom very much. So there are three key buttons. There's a mute, unmute in the very bottom left. We would like you to keep it with that red line across the microphone because that prevents background noise from kind of interfering with the rest of the presentations. There's a stop video, so if you don't want to be seen, you're welcome to sort of put a red line across that. And then the third button is the chat button. It's right in the bottom central, where if you press that, there's a little dialog box that pops up on the right. And you can use that for entering questions, which is how we get the questions to our speakers, and also share resources and other things. As always, we just ask that any comments and feedback be compassionate and respectful and courteous. We are recording this. These recording links will be sent to all the registrants. So if you just want to focus and take notes at some other time, you can do that as well. Just as further background, again, I'm Nathan Alberg. I've been passionate about all things farming and conservation for a long time. I'm with the Illinois Farmling program. Jeannie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey everybody. I'm Jeannie Jansen. I am also with the Farmland program at the Land Connection.
Right. Yeah, actually, while we're kind of finishing up some things here in these introductions, if you would like, in the audience, if you would like to share what kind of lease you have right now, is it a cash rent lease? Is it a crop share? Is it a flex lease? Is it written? Is it not written? We would love to just sort of hear what's happening with your land. So the Land Connection, just as a brief introduction, is a nonprofit based in Champaign. We have staff working remotely around the state, and our focus is trying to contribute to a better food and farming system for Illinois. And we really believe food and farming should be good for eaters in terms of nutrition, should be good for farmers in terms of their livelihoods, should be good for communities and in terms of having healthy economies, and it should be good for our land and water. And we do this work through farmer training, which includes our organic or grain conference every year, which I'd highly recommend. We also make food available locally, especially in the Champaign-Urbana area. And we are supportive of food access programs that make people able to afford local food that they otherwise might not be able to afford. And finally, we have the land access work that we do. This is called Illinois FarmLink. We have a staff person in each of the three regions of Illinois. They help with advising, empowering landowners and farmers around land in terms of resources and education programs like this. And also through connections. Our FarmLink website has a profile system, and we can also do direct connections. And I really want to highlight for all the landowners in the room that we do offer free advising. If you're looking for a farmer or want to think more about the direction of your land, we can offer free advising for free as many times as you want to talk to us. We'll help you connect with useful resources. Think about how you might find a farmer, what kind of farmer you want, even develop a farmer search plan. And you can find us at these different websites. Would highly recommend signing up for our newsletter so you can kind of get a stream of information about us. The 5-part webinar series that you're joining has kind of been working with this recipe, this like step process to kind of just make this complex process much more like less daunting and more understandable. So we've already talked about preparation. We've talked about planning. Last time we talked about how to find a farmer. And in this section, we're going to be talking more about how you create a good arrangement in terms of the lease and the pricing and tracking whether the farming is building the land the way you want it to be. And so today we're going to have Rachel Armstrong, Silas Brewster, and David Kleinschmidt, and also do a very quick poll at the end. I've included this image of these grain seeds on the right because we want you to think about this webinar series as like just sort of like planting seeds. Like it's just giving you an idea of all the factors involved and some good principles to apply so that when those issues come up for you, you know kind of what the basic landscape is and you know where else to get more information. And then next week, which will be the last series, we're going to talk more about building a good relationship with your farmer over time and whether you should consider having a farm manager if you're out of state or just don't have the time. And with that, we are going to go to our first presenter, who is Rachel Armstrong. While Rachel is loading her presentation, I'm just going to say a few things about Rachel. I've known her probably about 8 or 9 years. I'm really struck by two things. Number one, her strong dedication and passion for legal issues as they relate to farmers and farm communities. She is the founder and executive director of Farm Commons. And then she's also so good at explaining legal things in ways that the layperson can understand. I think you're really going to enjoy her presentation. Rachel, why don't you go ahead?
Terrific. All right. Thanks, Nathan. Explaining technical matters in normal everyday terms is what I am pretty passionate about. So got a pretty good niche over here. So my session is called Creating a Good Lease, Legal and Practical Perspectives. I don't necessarily see legal and practical as different. What works for us is often what works for the law. The law is written by normal people. So we're going to be mixing it up, but don't worry, I'll be sure to point out if something is a rule or if it is optional. If you haven't heard about Farm Commons before, we are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. Our mission is to empower agricultural communities to address their own legal vulnerabilities within an ecosystem of support. Now, day to day, that looks like a lot of educational resources. We write guides, lots of guides. We host in-person workshops. We do webinars like this one. You can also check out our podcast channel. We answer questions, all sorts of good stuff. Leadership development is also a part of our work. We know that farmers often have the best source of solutions to their own problems, just like landowners do as well. And so we help folks tell those stories about solutions that they've created with their peers. Now, a little bit more about me personally. I'm the executive director of Farm Commons. I also founded the organization. My background is in farming and food system development. And this is a picture of, my ancestors way back in the day. Shortly after, the land was stewarded by the Ojibwe people for many generations up here. Then the timber barons came through, cut off all the logs, and families like mine came in to settle and start farming. So my family grew cabbages and potatoes for a long time up here in the cold Northwoods. I'm joining you from Duluth, Minnesota. I really enjoyed the farming background and heritage that came with my upbringing, and I decided to go to law school when I was in my late 20s because I realized that our community needed better access to legal education. So going to law school felt perfectly reasonable at that time, and that's what I did. Fortunately, it worked out, and Farm Commons is the result of that. Now, as I begin to tell you about leasing and the law, I want to share an assumption that I have. It's a foundation of the conversation we're about to have, so I want to check it with you. Now, my assumption is that landowner and farmer tenant want to work proactively to achieve their share goals on the land while preventing problems from developing. Like Nathan showed earlier, a lot of folks, they strive to be friends and colleagues with the people that are using their land. Both folks care about the land and the viability of the farm. Folks just want peace at the end of the day. And the good news is that there are really great ways that we can use a lease to achieve that goal. I bring this up because leases can seem adversarial. I mean, we call them opposing parties, right? Yes, there is an element of that we need to be mindful of. But on the other hand, a lease is an agreement. A lease is a record of how we want to work together. And that process is highly cooperative as well. So what I'm bringing you today is not necessarily tricks and sneaky tips to gain the upper hand or to ensure maximum control over the dynamics on the land. That's no problem if that's your goal, but my presentation isn't quite geared to that. For that, I do recommend going to an attorney who can help you understand where there are opportunities for you to pull more levers of control on your land. So at Farm Commons, we see that folks are able to achieve their shared goals when they are in relationship with each other. That relationship is what supports the dialogue about what are our shared goals and how are we moving towards them. So I know this is a little unconventional for an attorney to say, but honestly, what we see at Farm Commons is the best place to start when talking about a lease arrangement is a conversation. That conversation is what leads to the kind of familiarity and shared understanding that we want to move from. So what do we talk about if we're getting together to visit about the land? Well, a bunch of stuff. So some of our basics include who we are, who's leasing the land, where is the land, and when is this relationship beginning? That's the easy stuff. You probably already thought about that. So let's move on to some more challenging items that often get overlooked. Infrastructure. And when I say that, I mean electricity. What kind of capacity is there for electricity on the property? Is there irrigation? Where is it? What is its capacity? Simple things like, is there a trash service? Is there storage on the property? And we can't stop at just, sure, there's a barn, put some stuff in there. Fuel, equipment, different kinds of storage or things that can or cannot be stored. It's important when we're talking about infrastructure and utilities to also address what happens if those facilities and utilities are damaged. Who pays to fix or restore these things? There are so many stories that I have heard, especially about irrigation on this subject. So, at the beginning of the season, it's like, sure, there's irrigation, go out there, do what you need doing. But then mid-season, the well pump breaks, the water table drops, something else happens. And the farmer is stuck in a bind thinking, I can't raise my crops, steward my livestock if I don't have water. And it becomes a very pressing question. Some crops can't go for more than a week without being watered. Animals, maybe not a day. So the question of who pays to fix or restore it and what happens if that time frame is not met becomes a matter of life and death for folks. There's more to talk about with improvements, especially with farmers who grow specialty crops, fruits and vegetables. Can folks put up a hoop house? For animals, can they repair fences? Can they upgrade the electrical capacity? Like, if they want to start doing chickens and they're buying the little chicks. Most landowners will say, hey, I love an improvement. You go right ahead, repair that fence. I'm not going to stand in your way. But obviously, there's more to discuss. Okay, who covers the costs? If the farmer is contributing the labor, oftentimes the landowner might contribute the supplies. But then who has ownership of that thing, especially if that thing is movable? Then can the farmer, take it with them when their relationship ends? If they can't take it with them, and it was very shortly after the thing was installed, the farmer might come calling and say, oh, look, I didn't get to benefit from all this labor I did to repair the fences. Can you compensate me? It is so much easier to answer those questions when we have had that conversation before the bad thing happened. It's of course, it's when emotions are less high, stress is low, and we're better able to think about what our capacity and our resources are. So all this conversation, you might be thinking, oh boy, if we start talking about these things, we might come up with some conflict. Yes, that might be true. I'm going to tell you a story. I was at a conference several years ago. I'm busy, getting my lunch tray, sitting down at a table, and this young gal comes up and she sits down and says, Rachel, I attended one of your programs on leasing and it was terrific. I just want to say thank you. So, I continue the conversation and I say, well, that's great. Tell me about your farm. What do you do? She says, oh, I don't have a farm. I'm still trying to get into it. And I'm thinking, I thought you were, that my program was a success, that you must have a good lease. And she said, no, I took your advice. I had a great conversation with the person I was working with, and I discovered we were not on the same page. That this was going to be a difficult uphill climb if I wanted to work with this person. And you know what? I walked away, and I think I really dodged a bullet. I think I saved myself time and money, and that I'm in a better place, even though I'm still searching for the right relationship. It's starting to sound a little bit like marriage and family, right? But hey, if you're looking for something long-term, it's not a bad perspective to take. So sometimes success is the relationship does not continue. So keep that in mind, and don't let the idea that you might break the deal keep you from bringing up what needs to be said. When we're talking about specialty crops, and again, that's fruits, vegetables, herbs, in the parlance of the USDA, the reliability of water access for irrigation is essential, but don't discount water for washing. Water for washing versus water for irrigation, they have two different regulatory schemes that they have to comply with. And washing water especially needs to be tested more, and the safeguards and securities around that are increased. Especially crop producers often need access to packing, storage, and refrigeration. And their refrigeration part can play into the electrical capacity that your barn may or may not have. These folks often want sales or retail opportunities to move their product on site, and may want folks to come by, to hang out, to attend parties, festivals. So keep in mind if that is okay with you. Our animal and our livestock people have their concerns as well. You might have opinions, thoughts, needs on limiting the species, cows versus chickens, the breeds, the head counts, and stocking rates that you're comfortable with on your land. So that's an important conversation. Fence repair and maintenance becomes really important here. Animals do get out sometimes, and that is a serious liability concern. So addressing the consequences of escape, and especially insurance. In most situations, both the landowner and the farmer are going to request that the other carry insurance, and very often that they name each other as additional insureds, so that we've got all the layers if something should happen to those animals that impacts others. So putting authentic agreement and understanding at the foundation of your relationship is a really important part of ensuring your success over the long term. When you begin to understand each other's goals, preferences, you can navigate the unexpected and the things that might come to you. Now, I'm saying this as an attorney And I want to note something that's really important about what we're talking about right now. This is because you're a business person, and this is because you are leasing to a business person. You are landlord and farmer. And under the law, business people have wide latitude to make the business arrangements that work for them. This is not the same for residential housing. Residents are not business people and do not have nearly as much latitude to come up with what works for them. Instead, many layers of control, the state, local government, have said this is what we must do to protect residents in homes. That's not the same way with business folks. So keep that in mind. And that can complicate your situation if your lease is both for farmland and for a farmhouse, that you're going to get boxed in what you can and can't do for that house. Some folks will have two different ones. There's the lease that adheres for the farmhouse, that adheres to residential rules, and then have just the farmland in a separate lease so that they can preserve the flexibility of commercial law. Okay, but you know that I've been talking about conversation all this time, and how's that a lease? When do we get to the lease? First off, I want you to know that there's a misconception out there that a lease needs to adopt a pre-prescribed legal format or contain some opaque and confusing clauses to be legitimate. In reality, a lease is simply a summary of your own agreement. The word lease itself means that someone has a right to use land that is not their own. So if somebody has a right to use that land, they have a lease. It's in the agreement. It's not actually in the paper that says lease on top. So there's not magic to it. A lot of folks tend to use a form, and they think that, well, there's something special about these. They are important. Lease forms, templates, and models can be helpful to inspire us. A lot of times folks want to know what everyone else is doing. Well, what is my neighbor doing with cover crops, fence repair? Do they allow animal slaughter? There's nothing wrong with that, but remember, your operation, your needs and your goals are unique to you. And just like you might ask your friend for advice, you want to know how others feel. But also think of that classic parent and teenager exchange. Teenager comes home and says, but mom, all my friend farmland landlords, they don't require their tenant farmers to cover crop. Why do we have to? And mom says, okay, and if all your landlord friends went and ran off a cliff, would you do that too? So just keep in mind what others are doing is information, not prescription. And that information is most useful when you've already analyzed your own goals and begun the conversation about your shared needs with others. As commercial operators, you have a huge latitude within the law to structure the agreement that you want. But writing is really important, and I don't want to discount that by stressing the conversation. Start by talking through the questions together. How are we dealing with these things and coming to agreement? But then definitely write out your agreement. There is nothing wrong with plain language, and that is a legitimate legal document. Assemble it into a series of listed points so it's easy to find that information. Writing it down also helps you clarify what you really mean. I do recommend seeking review by an attorney, and when you've done all of this legwork, you are much more likely to get the lease that you want going into an attorney. An attorney at this stage is very useful for helping to make sure that your lease is enforceable and that you haven't left any gaping holes in it and forgot something. Also, many folks choose to file with the county register of deeds to put others on notice that that land has a leasing relationship to it. Seeking review by an attorney can help you with these processes. It does come with a fee. So being prepared can help you minimize those costs.
County Register of Deeds.
And like I said, writing is essential to preserve memory and create clarity. But you might have heard somewhere that the lease needs to be in writing to be valid. Well, technically, yes. It's a little something called the statute of frauds. Leases that are for longer than 1 year do need to be in writing to be enforceable. But there are loopholes to that. And if somebody still wants to pursue justice in that case, there are other legal grounds that they have to seek justice, no matter which side of the arrangement that they are on. So I got a couple more slides. Types of lease payment arrangements. There are several. Here are 3 standards. We've got our cash rent. This is where the tenant pays a fixed dollar amount per acre, maybe even for the whole farm. This doesn't share risk. It provides the landowner with guaranteed steady income, minimal management, but there are some downsides. The tenant bears all the production and price risk. And because the tenant holds all the risk, well, they might lack the incentive or ability to invest in long-term sustainability. Crop share strikes at a little bit more of a balance. The rent is paid as a percentage of the harvested crop. So the landowner shares, generally here, the landowner will share in the input costs and management. This is often done because the landowner wants self-employment tax benefits and other eligibility for government programs. So it requires even more of a relationship and an interaction between folks. Crop share can also get the landowner with, a pile of corn or soybeans at the end of the day that they're going to have to market. Now, a lot of times ask the farmer to please help them market it at the same time, but it is literally getting paid in part with crops. The flexible cash lease strikes yet another balance where the tenant pays in cash, but the amount fluctuates based on yield, market price, or other factors that the folks are going to come up with. It can help help alleviate the tenant from bearing all the risk while requiring less active management from the landowner if that's not what they need. You can integrate all kinds of conservation principles and practices into the lease. Start with that conversation. Get on the same page with the farmer about what it is you care about and what they are capable of and have the knowledge to do. Note that one of the most critical steps to ensuring conservation is a long-term lease. Tenants don't have incentive to build soil fertility or make improvements if they risk losing the land the next year. If a long-term lease is impossible, include provisions to reimburse the tenant for unused value of conservation improvements at the end of the lease. And then from there, don't hesitate to list specific practices that you want, like cover crops, no GMOs, no aerial spraying, vegetative buffer strips. Just because the neighbors aren't doing it doesn't mean you can't. It's your land. All right. That's the end of the formal slides I have. Would love to address questions that you have.
Rachel, thank you so much for that. We have a question. What timeline do you consider long-term tenure?
Oh, that is a great question. And a lot of that has to do with what are our goals. Some farmers and landowners are looking to perennialize. They don't want to do corn and soybeans anymore. Hazelnuts, all kinds of silvopasture techniques. In that case, long term, it's going to be 20 years, 30 years for some of these to really achieve the yield that folks need off of them. Now, for corn and soybeans, 5 years, that might be long because the investments that we're making have a different time scale to them. So it depends. Most folks are stuck at 1 year. So if you can get past that, you're doing good.
Scott, do you want to say anything? You asked the question. Do you want to say anything about what kind of farming you're thinking about with a long-term lease? I think you're muted, by the way.
Sorry about that. We've got an alfalfa row crop farm, small, 170 acres, and we've been doing. We went from a gentleman's handshake arrangement that my uncle had to something more formal because we're running it from a remote location most of the time. So we with the help of a local attorney, we did a 3-year lease. mostly because the farmer wanted to plant alfalfa, and you need that's a 3 to 5 year commitment in terms of reseeding. So that's what we've done. So the 3 years sounds like a logical spot for us to be, from what you're saying.
Yeah.
Good.
Thank you.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot, Scott. Any other questions? I know we have someone on here with a crop share. Any other questions you might have for Rachel and about these conversations and that kind of thing? Rachel, how do you find a good attorney who knows farming?
That is a rough one. Ask around is a primary strategy. That being said, attorneys in rural areas who have experience with farming, they're not making a lot of new ones anymore. And a lot of folks will end up going to larger cities and urban areas. The number one thing you can do is know what you want ahead of time. I don't advise walking in to say, I need a lease. What do you got for me? You don't really want whatever they're going to pull out of the drawer for that. That was for the last guy who came in. So do your work ahead of time, know what it is you want, know where the other party is at so that you're not asking them to negotiate for you. And their strengths are ensuring it's enforceable and making sure that the lease is consistent. A lot of folks think, well, I'm going to talk to them about what other people do. Talk to other people or extension agents or other educators about what other people do, because you're going to get that information a lot cheaper.
So it's okay to have an attorney like in a city 200 miles away. You can still do that business that way.
You sure can. Yeah, they're going to apply the same skills. They won't have the intimate knowledge of farming, but if that's not what you're turning to them for, if you've done the work to figure out what you want and what's going to work for you, they'll be just as good as someone else.
Got it. And any small, like super like practical tips about having those sit down conversations? Should you do it in person? Should you do it in the morning? Should you do it like over coffee, or should you avoid alcoholic beverages? What do you recommend?
Right. I recommend a pen and paper. My memory is pretty short, so that can help me keep notes as I'm going. So for me, whatever facilitates that. Different folks are comfortable with different things. Some people would want to stop by for dinner. Other people would be like, no, that's too uncomfortable. I don't know you that well. So it is a little bit of that. It's like making a new friend. You're not quite sure when you start how that interaction should go, but keep your eyes and ears open, ask questions, and you'll get there.
Got it. It sounds good. One last call for questions. Otherwise, we're going to move on to the next one. All right. Actually, last question for you, Rachel. What's the one thing people most forget to figure out in that conversation that comes back to bite them?
Infrastructure, for sure. And not just, can I store my stuff in the barn, but what happens if the barn burns down, and the landowner isn't rebuilding? And now there is no place to store the stuff in the barn. A lot of farmers in that situation are expecting some kind of discount, some sort of, communication about that. And so don't forget to take that step to talk about what happens if that thing goes away, through no fault of anyone's, but it's still going to be important.
That's great that you mentioned that, because in our last session, we had a landowner and a farmer talking, and it was a bison grazing arrangement. It was a 15-year arrangement. The reason that the farmer was so intent on getting all the details right is that before she got that lease, she had a lease with a private individual who was out of state. And there was a water line problem that the landowner had responsibility for, and he did not fix it. He was not fixing it, and the bison were not getting water. So it became super desperate, and they had to terminate it. So it's just a good reminder that, like you said, infrastructure and responsiveness are super important. So, all right, I think we're going to move on. Rachel, thank you so much. We're going to have a Q&A at the very end too. So if anyone has any more questions and wants to put those in the chat, we can get to those at the end of the session. So next, we're going to have Silas. Silas, if you don't mind starting to load your slides. Silas Berkson is with CommonGround. He's going to explain what CommonGround is. But the most important thing for you to know is that Silas works with lease pricing pretty much every day. And I think he really has a good understanding of what's happening, especially with commodities. But he's also done a lot of research about other types of lease pricing. And I think you're going to learn quite a bit from Silas. Silas, you want to take it away?
All right. Hello, everyone. Can we see my slide deck?
All good.
Okay, great. Hey, my name's Silas Berkson. Thanks for having me. I'm the director of leasing at CommonGround, and I've been doing that for 4 years. So working pretty intimately with leases, lease pricing, and just want to emphasize um, how good of information that Rachel just shared with us. It's really strong stuff, and a lot of the folks we work with would benefit from having that at their disposal. Um, a little background on me: I grew up in Eastern Iowa, in the Iowa City area. I did not grow up in a farming family, but had some family and friends who are farming, and so was able to have some exposure to that, where I, gained my appreciation for agriculture and feel fortunate the last 4 years to been able to work in that space with CommonGround. And I'll tell you a little bit about CommonGround here because it's kind of where my expertise in the space comes from. And we work directly with lease pricing and do a lot of business in the state of Illinois. So CommonGround is an agricultural land leasing marketplace. And we built this to connect landowners and farmers in a transparent way and help to facilitate cooperative and transparent lease agreements. So we wanted to give landowners a way to see all of their options when it comes to who is interested in farming their ground. And on the other hand, we wanted to give farmers a tool and insight onto the lease opportunities in their area that otherwise they may have never known about. So the way that this works, our marketplace, if I was a landowner and I had a farm I was looking to lease that had open tenancy, I could come to the website and I could map out my farm and describe the lease offering. How long of a lease am I trying to offer? How many acres is it? And when you publish that on the site, us at CommonGround, we would make sure that every farmer in the area knows about that lease opportunity and has a chance to ask questions about it, maybe walk the ground, ultimately decide if they want to submit an offer. And the way they submit an offer is in a competitive format, so a bidding style, and that's how we drive the price transparency. But what's cool about the platform is that high bid on a lease does not automatically win it. So the landowner is going to remain in full control. And what we do is during this bidding period, we collect information on each farmer so they can share a little bit about their goals, their farming practices, what their operation looks like. We pass that along to the landowner. The landowner is able to review that. They can interview each farmer, each bidder, and ultimately decide to move forward with whoever seems to be the best fit for them. We've done the bulk of our business throughout Illinois. That's where we started, and so eager to share what I know about lease pricing here. One other tool that CommonGround offers is called our cash rent estimate tool or cash rentstimate tool. And this is a tool a landowner can go on our site and map out their farm, and we will provide a range of what they should probably be earning on per acre on a cash rent basis. And so we have an algorithm that takes into account a couple dozen factors to help us come up with this range. Some of those factors being PI or productivity index. We look at the average county yields, precipitation, the shape of the fields, flood zone maps, current commodity prices, and then current market data as well. So this gives a range. We're not able to tell you exactly what your farm should rent for, but feel pretty confident that the range we're giving is appropriate based on what we know about your farm. And so here is just a snapshot of what that estimate report looks like. So in the top left here, you can see that range we talked about providing. On the bottom left, we feature a few of those factors that play into the algorithm. And then on the right side, we can see a soil map and soil table. So we're going to show you what soils your farm consists of, and then ultimately be able to give you an average PI or productivity index, which I'll talk about a little more. So before we get into these different lease types and lease structures and prices, it is important to understand a common way that farms are talked about in Illinois, which is through the lens of PI, productivity index. So this is a system that was developed by researchers at the University of Illinois to help classify farmland and soils based on their productivity or their crop bearing capabilities. And so you'll often hear farmers speak about farms in terms of Class A, Class B, Class C, or subprime farmland. And that's just where those farms' average PIs fall on a scale of 0 to 147, where the high end of that scale is really productive farmland, and as you go lower, a little less productive. So if we look at this map of the state of Illinois, we can see central Illinois, northern Illinois, we see some really these dark greens, those really productive soils. And then as you go south in Illinois, a little bit less so. So PI is important. It is not the end all be all when it comes to the value of your farm lease, but it should be considered. So we'll start here talking about conventional row crops. Most farm ground in the state of Illinois is farmed conventionally. And we're talking about corn and soybeans primarily. And just to relate back to that Class A, Class B, Class C, we can kind of narrow down lease pricing based on where your farmland falls there. So with like a Class A farm in Illinois right now, typically you're going to see between $375 to $450 an acre. A Class B farm might rent from $275 to $375 an acre. Class C between $200, $275, and subprime being between $150 and $200 an acre. So we talked about soil class being a factor that's going to influence this. There's a lot of factors that are going to play into the pricing of your row crop ground. One of those is going to be infrastructure. So is there pattern tile drainage on the farm? Is there irrigation? Are there grain storage facilities? What are the current commodity prices? Do we have the historical yields of this farm and know what it's going to produce? How many bushels? What's the length of the lease? What is the layout and what does access look like for this farm? Is my farmer able to get their biggest machinery in and out of the field easily? Are there owner costs associated with this lease? So is the owner sharing in maintenance or any shared responsibilities? That's going to influence the lease rate. The lease type, so the cash rent, crop share, or a flex agreement, and then the payment schedule as well. When it comes to organic row crops, we're seeing an increased demand for organic crops in general, and we have a pretty wide range here of what you could expect for income based on a multitude of factors. One of the biggest things to consider when you're thinking about leasing for organic crop production is the 36-month period or the transition period that it takes for a farmer to sell their crop as certified organic. So this is a 36-month period where your farmer is not allowed to use any banned substances on the farm, so synthetic fertilizers, synthetic pesticides, things that typically, help farmers to get bigger, more successful crops and larger yields. So during this 36-month period, your farmer is essentially doing the additional labor of farming organic, but not able to sell their crop at the organic premium. And just for reference, a bushel of non-organic soybeans might be able to sell for $11 a bushel once that is certified organic, you might be closer to $20 a bushel. So it's a pretty substantial difference. But during that period, and I guess I just want to emphasize this, 36 months, I say that rather than 3 years, like not necessarily 3 crop years, because depending on when you start this period, you could have it where your farmer is able to plant their crop where it's not considered organic, but by the end of that crop growing and at harvest time, they could harvest it as an organic crop. What we see typically with landowners and farmers on this is landowners can expect a decrease maybe 30 to 50% in rental income during that transition period to accommodate for the farmer, doing this extra work, not able to sell at a premium. When they're farming organic, they're going to see lesser yields than non-organic. And so we see during that transition period, a lesser rental income. And then once that transition period's over, we can shoot up that rent, typically much, much higher. So some additional factors to consider here is that additional labor where your farmers, having to either be using more fuel, doing weed control or manual. We want to think about that organic premium that your farmer is able to profit off of after that transition period. There's also a non-GMO premium, a much lesser than organic. But we're looking at the cost for the farmer and as well as those decreased yields. So lots of factors we can look at with organic row crops. Now with hay ground, a typical lease range that we see in the state of Illinois can be anywhere from $50 to $150 per acre. And this depends on a multitude of factors, as these all do. So we could look at the type of hay that's on the ground. How many cuttings per year is the farmer able to get off of this ground? Are they able to get 3 cuttings per year or 5 cuttings per year? You can see different cuttings across the state of Illinois. What is the lease type? Is it a strict cash rent, or is there a crop share where you have some risk on both ends? Another thing to look at is this an established, really productive hayfield, or is it a new field where the farmer's taking more risk and seeding it and making sure it's successful? What is the current market price of hay? Directly is going to impact the profitability for your farmer. And then, of course, just looking at split costs. If that's part of the arrangement where the landowner is helping to pay for fertilizer, that needs to be considered as well. Quite typical in Illinois, we'll see arrangements where it is more of a crop share or a revenue share, where if it's a new field where the farmer's taking risks seeding it, the landowner might expect 25 to 30% of that hay or the revenue from that hay. And if it's an established field that's already producing and you rent it to a farmer, maybe the landowner's taking 35 or even 40% of that. So when it comes to grazing ground, there's a couple different ways we typically see lease arrangements structured. We do see some just strict dollar per acre that can keep it simple. Another method of leasing this is an amount of money per head per day or per cow-calf pairing per day. And another really common one is called animal unit month. And that's a formula that looks at the size of the animal and how much forage they're going to consume over a month, and then taking into account the market value of that forage to come up with a lease rate. And so some factors that are also going to play into this is going to be water source. Is it available and abundant on the property? Is fencing existent, and is it just perimeter fencing, or is there grid fencing where your farmer can do rotational grazing and not have to remove all the animals from the property as frequently? What kind of forage is on the ground? What does the terrain of that ground look like? Is it easy for your farmer to get in there and check on all their livestock? What type of livestock is on the ground? They're going to have different impacts on the land that you'll want to consider. And then, of course, just landowner costs, depending on what your agreement looks like. So I want to reiterate here that no two farms are the exact same. No two farmers' businesses are the exact same. Landowners' goals for their ground and how they'd like it farmed are often different. And so leases are not going to be the exact same. There's not really a complete data set on leasing out there, that's going to tell you exactly what you should be getting for your ground. So I advise people to do their best in thinking about all these factors that play into the type of farm lease you're considering and discuss those with your farmer. And I think if you're doing that much, you're likely going to find yourself in an appropriate range for your farm income. Here I've included, if you're interested in looking more county specific for your farm, some resources that could help point you in the right direction. So the USDA, they publish yearly results, often incomplete, sometimes underreported. CommonGround, which is our company, you can check out. We publish lease auction data. There's also local companies that'll publish lease auction results. The University of Illinois Ag Extension is a great resource. And then I included the Illinois Department of Natural Resources as well, as they publish some mostly hay auction results. And I'm happy to take any questions that have popped up. Oh, you're muted, Nathan, if you're talking.
So you don't mind if people kind of follow up with you with any questions or thoughts?
Not at all. Yeah, happy to look specifically. If anyone has questions, happy to look specifically at that farm and share whatever information I have on the area or past leasing results that we have.
Got it. We have a question from Scott. What about pricing for our buildings? Scott, do you want to get online and actually explain what kind of buildings you're talking about?
Yeah, with part of what we do, besides leasing the land, we also lease a large pole shed that the farmer pays rent for to store hay. And I have a really hard time in Wisconsin anyway, finding good information on, what square footage, dirt floor versus concrete floor. I think the information I use to set our rent is old, and I'm just curious if there's a better place to find that kind of information.
I wish I had a good answer for you. We've gotten that quite a bit. Unfortunately, I don't. The situations we've dealt with, we've seen like what we think is a premium on just like cash rent lease auction results when the owner indicates, hey, I have this big of a grain storage facility or this barn that you can store stuff in. And we do see what we think is a little premium to the results, but not enough to break down for you what exactly that should be worth.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Scott. Any other questions about lease pricing? One factor you mentioned, Silas, was length of lease. So does a longer lease maybe prompt the farmer to consider a higher price for the lease because he's got more stability?
Yeah, I mean, you can think about it a couple ways. One of those is that way. It's if I'm a farmer and I can lock in a lease for a longer amount of time, I'm going to reinvest. I know I'm going to have this farm, so I can invest in it heavily with inputs and make sure it's really productive. It gives me some safety, not thinking I'm going to put a bunch of inputs on this farm and then it's going to get taken from me right after the season. So you can think about it that way. You could also think about it is just like uncertainty in the world. And if I'm a farmer and you're like, okay, I'm locking in this high lease rate for 3 or 4 or 5 years, and obviously there's always the potential for downturns in commodity prices. So there's different ways to think about it.
It makes a lot of sense. You also mentioned differences in payment systems. So whether it's 100% one time upfront or if it's maybe split between 2 times. Can you say more about that as well?
Yeah. So I think that just comes down to landowner, how they perceive risk. Maybe a landowner is more willing to have a lesser lease rate if it's 100% upfront because they've been paid for the year. They don't really have to think about what the commodity prices are or profitability for the farmer or how the harvest turns out. Um, so that's how you can kind of think about that risk-wise for the landowner. Also, you see some landowners thinking about it for tax reasons as well, whether they want one big payment or they want to split that up.
So what would be the normal timing of those two payments if you had two payments?
Yeah, typically we see like a March payment ahead of planting and then a harvest payment. So coming in November.
Okay, got it.
And I'd say that's
Okay,
the most typical. Yep.
got it. Okay, not seeing any other questions. Silas, thank you so much for a really thorough presentation. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay. All right, David, if you don't mind loading yours up. Our next presenter, oh, thank you for that. Our next presenter is David Kleinschmidt with Progressive Agronomy. He also presented earlier in the series about soil biology. He grew up on a diversified farm and eventually got into this agricultural business side of things, and later had sort of a realization about how farming with just relying on chemicals wasn't really the best thing, the most sustainable thing. And he's kind of become a great resource for a lot of people around the country about implementing more soil biology built farming approaches. And David, we're really happy to have you talking with us today. Why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, Nathan. Um, Hopefully my voice holds out. I lost my voice 2 days ago and it's coming back gradually here. So um, bear with me here. So Nathan asked me to talk a little bit about soil testing, different soil test methods out there, and a little bit on how we should look at soil test and soil health and how they're kind of related here. So um, I guess when I want to talk about things first, like looking at and previously we talked about the soil biology in a couple weeks ago. And so to bring this fast forward here, there's a lot of talk in the agricultural industry about soil health and what it is, what it isn't. And I view it as kind of it's a holistic approach. It's a biochemical physical system when we're looking at our soils. Most of the time in this regenerative ag space, we hear a lot about the biological side of soils and looking at the microbes and things like that. And we have to understand how microbes interact with both the physical portions of the sand, silt, and clay particles that are in that soil, and how they interact with even that or the chemical portion of the nutrients and everything that are in there, and what the microbes can do for us in terms of buffering nutrients, and even when we make a pesticide application and things like that, of how they buffer it over time. So all of these things, when you look at the bottom of the slide, all of these things are basically connected. And when you start thinking about this, if you go out and you have a tree in your yard and you start pulling on a limb, you kind of shake that whole tree, or that spider web effect. And really, that's how all of these are connected. And I think we need to start understanding that it's just not a chemical system. The soil is just our sand, silt, and clay, and we pour fertilizer onto it and plant a crop, and we yield something. But there's a whole nother aspect to the soils that we never really looked at previously. So I say all that to say, excuse me, that all soil tests are wrong and some are useful. Dr. Buzzclute, as a quote from him, and I completely agree with this. When you start to analyze things and really look at it, of what they are and what they aren't, I think our traditional soil tests, we've always looked at them as being 100% accurate. And we've used them to build up soil for fertility values. So we either do a buildup or maintenance or a crop removal. But they do not tell us actually how many pounds are available. Those soil tests were designed basically on a law of diminishing returns. So once you build up your soil's fertility value to a certain point, then your crop yield isn't going to enhance any as far as phosphorus and potassium and some of the micro and secondary nutrients are concerned. Your yield isn't going to actually be influenced by that additional pounds of fertilizer that we put out there. And so that's why we kind of look at them as parts per million more than pounds per acre, or that's how they should be viewed in that soil. They our standard soil tests that we've relied on for the last almost 80 years now. They don't mimic plant roots. They don't really take into consideration some of the textural differences of soils. They don't take into consideration annual rainfall, tillage practices, crop rotations, or anything like that. And they do not test for biological activity. Most of these tests are using acids that are pretty harsh, that are never naturally seen in nature, that can actually over extract nutrients from that profile, and give us some false readings. I kind of like to take an approach of soil testing as a Goldilocks approach. I don't want the soils to be too dry, too wet, too hot, or too cold. All of these things will impact the test results ultimately, and especially when we're talking about biological systems. When you start talking about biology, think about ourselves. We are more biological than what we are human. And when it is too cold outside, we're not too keen on going out and moving and doing things. We're kind of slow down and kind of tend to want to hibernate. And also when it's too hot, So if we start thinking about that, our soil system is kind of working in that same manner. And so we want to make sure that our soils have good oxygen in them, that they're not too wet, and they're not too hot, because that's going to kill off microbes. Too cold, they're not going to be real functional. Too dry, they're not going to be real functional either. Like I said before, soil testing does not consider tillage practices or crop rotations. They don't look at nutrient interactions, and that's, I think, incredibly important when we start looking at synergism between nutrients, because some nutrients are antagonistic to others if they're in excess. So we start to look at, soil fertility and crop nutrition. When we start looking at those as one and not separate, if we have an excess of one nutrient in the soil, it could be limiting another nutrient that the plant really needs for cell division or sugar production or things like that, that are very essential. Now we're having to spend more money feeding that plant something that it couldn't get from the soil because of excess nutrients. The timing of fertilizer applications is really important, because sometimes we'll spread fertilizer in the fall time. Well, they're going back to these nutrient interactions, that there are nutrients that can tie up other nutrients, especially with phosphorus and potassium, that if we spread it in the fall time, by the time we plant a crop in the spring, we might only get 30 to 40% of that actually available to the plant, because it's bound up and tied up by other nutrients in that profile. So that's really important to understand. And the pH of the soil can really alter the result of certain nutrients. So this is coming from the Illinois Agronomy Handbook. When I talk about, all soil tests are wrong, and we've often relied on the soil test to be 100% accurate. And what we see here is that this is a perspective on the reliability, usefulness, and cost effectiveness of soil tests. Excuse me, is that the only thing that's 100% is water pH. You start looking at the phosphorus test is 85% accurate and reliable. The potassium test is 60% accurate and reliable. Some of the micronutrients, I would question why we even test for them when you get into the teens and 20% accuracy and reliability on that. What kind of management decisions can we make when we're leaving 80% to gamble? Potassium and phosphorus are the two biggest ones that we look at on our soil test and say, well, these levels are low or high. Well, depending on if the soils were really dry when we sampled or really wet, those could have altered those values. And also, was it right after a harvest or before harvest? Things like that could all alter those values as well. And those values will change throughout the entire growing season. When we start looking at nutrients by pH, by soil type, if we're a sandy soil and we're a 6.0 pH or below, we see that there are a lot of nutrients that are tied up that just aren't accurate when we start to measure it on that test. As we go down and we start looking at loam or clay loam soils, those are those Class A soils that we were talked about previously. Those are our really good soils, and we typically don't have too much of an issue. But the one thing you start seeing is phosphorus is pretty consistent when you're at a 6.0 or less pH. As we go up on that scale, we still have issues with some of those nutrients at different soils textures that could be a problem. So I think it's time that we start rethinking soil fertility and start understanding about the whole biological aspect of the soil and realize that plants only take up about 10% of the nutrients we apply directly. The remaining 90% need to be taken up through a microbe. And so essentially, just like when we eat food, we're relying on the microbes in our gut to break down the food and so we can digest and absorb that. And that same thing is happening in our soils. So, even though the microbes will help break down the 90% of these nutrients, the plant's only going to take up about 30 to 40% of the total nutrients that we apply. I talk to farmers about this this is kind of a pretty poor ROI, really. It's like telling you, hey, we're going, I'm asking to borrow $1 million. I'm going to give you 30% up front the next year in return, but after that, I'm only going to give you 1% back. That's usually what happens with our soils and fertility when we try to build up over time, is that we really don't see a huge return back. And it ends up costing us a lot of money, especially when we're talking about phosphorus prices over $1,000 a ton and things like that. You got to start questioning, is this even worthwhile? And so the other thing is we need to start measuring biology. We've not been measuring the biological aspect of the soil because it's been very confusing for a number of years to know, okay, what species are there and what are they actually doing? And I'd like to say, well, maybe it doesn't matter what species we have, as long as we have something that's active. So going and looking at this, just a quick slide from the University of Illinois showing that, oftentimes we think that we fertilize a crop and our plant's taking up fertilizer. And so this is using radioactive isotopes with nitrogen and looking at how much nitrogen was actually taken up by a corn plant through the fertilizer versus the soil itself. And we see that on average, about 30% of the nitrogen taken up by a plant is actually from soil, that organic nitrogen forms, from the fertilizer, and about 70% is actually taken up from the soil, from those organic forms of nitrogen, proteins, amino acid complexes from the soil, and phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients. They all work the same way. So typically, we've always thought that, we're measuring this pool of nutrients in the soil, and this has got to be the total pool. This is how many pounds of fertilizer in that soil. And what we're actually measuring is this middle pool here. That's the exchangeable pool. The total pool is actually a much larger pool of nutrients that we could digest out and measure with a test called a total nutrient digestion, or there's some other tests out there that can actually measure the total amount in that 6-inch soil profile that we would send in. The exchangeable pool is just looking at using those acids and how much can be exchanged off of that total pool. But even that exchangeable pool isn't telling us the plant available pool, which is a whole nother test that we could look at to understand, what are our plants actually seeing here? Do we have enough here to supply that plant on a pounds per acre per day basis, and stop looking at just a trend that we've always looked at and try to feed plants more efficiently? So this is a total nutrient digestion, looking at a 6-inch profile. And what you see here is, there's about 45,000 pounds of carbon in that top 6 inches. There's 4,000 pounds worth of nitrogen material. 976 of phosphorus, 2,600 pounds of potassium, 11,000 pounds of calcium. So there's a tremendous amount of nutrients in the top 6 inches. So when people talk about, yo, we're mining our soils, I always revert back to this and say, do you know how many years it's going to take a 230 bushel corn crop that removes 69 pounds of P2O5 out of that soil to replace that 900, to actually eliminate that 976 pounds? And we don't farm just 6 inches. Those roots are going down way deeper into that profile and accessing more nutrients in that profile than what we're actually testing for. But it's those microbes in that soil, having those interactions with the plants that are actually making that phosphorus and those other nutrients available to the plant itself. So this is a standard soil test. This is what typically, if we were to look at the Malick or the Bray test that we've been using for, boy, I don't know, well, since the 40s really with the Bray. The Malick 3 is updated in the 80s. But if we look at it, this is what we're typically looking at. We look at, well, in Illinois, we don't typically look at nitrate. I haven't measured nitrates because I want to see how much nitrogen is in that soil. But we look at phosphorus, these N3 level here. We look at potassium. And this is a dried soil test, which is different than a moist soil test, but that's a whole nother conversation. I could talk about this for hours with somebody. We look at magnesium, sodium, cation exchange capacity, the saturation, base saturations, and the amount of hydrogen, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium that's in there. We look at pH, organic matter, and some micronutrients as well. The one interesting thing here is, so typically the university systems or the standard systems that we'd use would say the Bray test or the Malick, and both would be a good test, they would say, depending on your soil pH and where you're at. Well, if we look at this test, and this is using the ICP extraction method, but to measure these nutrients. So the first line here, Bray P1 is a 32 parts per million for phosphorus. Well, the same sample on a Malick 3 was a 50 parts per million. So going back to all soil tests are wrong, so which one of these two are right and wrong? Well, we really don't know. And the scary thing is that actually some labs run the Malick and they multiply it by a factor to convert it to a Bray and report it as a Bray. Well, depending on what your soil pH is, that phosphorus that it's reporting could be totally overestimating or underestimating your phosphorus supply or that exchangeable phosphorus in that soil profile. So there's a lot of confusion about how accurate these tests really are. This is and the one thing go about this test, so there's nothing on here about soil biology. So fast forward, go to this test was really developed in 2012 or 2009 era. This is called a Haney soil health test, and I use Regen Ag Lab because Rick Haney that developed this test here in Temple, Texas, he actually retired and now he's working for Lance Gunderson at Regen Ag Lab on the staff. So I send my soil test to him, knowing that the guy that invented the test is on staff and can review these, and I trust these results. But here in the soil health, as we look down through this, there's a lot of numbers on here, and this is very confusing. But we see a soil respiration parts per million. Basically, that is saying when this soil becomes wet with water, the microbes become active. Oftentimes, think about if you've heard the phrase, you go outside and you can smell a rain coming. What you're smelling is the wetting of that soil from a distance is waking up the acetylmycetes and some other bacteria and fungi in that soil that are releasing this odor called geosmin, and that's what we're smelling. So with this test, we take the soil, we dry it out, and they re-wet it from the bottom up, basically simulating that inch of rainfall to see how active the biology is here. And then we go through and we look at organic carbon with the water extraction method to see this organic carbon is basically the food source for the biology to say, do we have enough food for them? And then this percent MAC is, do the microbes actually like the food that's being fed to them? Beyond that, I mean, start looking at this test. There's a whole lot of data here, and trust me, I don't have enough time to go through this, but there's a huge amount of opportunity to understand how to use this test. This test wasn't designed for that law of diminishing returns necessarily. There are some factors on that. This test is really designed to understand when you catch an inch of rain, how many pounds per acre could become available to you, and use it more as a credit system to understand how much fertilizer do we really need to apply to raise that corn crop or that bean crop, but then using it as a biological indicator of how active are our soils. I like the term that conventional test has become kind of a test that looks at our soils like a doctor looking at a high school football player for a physical. And on the outside, they look really good. They look really strong. But if we started doing an MRI, CAT scan, CT scan, all these scans on them, we'd understand that there's injuries internally that are causing stress and inflammation to the body. And our standard soil tests don't understand, they don't pick up some of the stress, where this test, looking at the biological aspect, really kind of indicates where our weak points are in the soil. And, you start looking at it and say, well, how is this soil going to perform if we get rains? And potentially, how well is this soil going to hold together aggregate wise? So this sample here was in a field, and this sample here was taken 10 feet away in a fence row. And so you remember that first sample was a 53 parts per million respiration, and this one's at 308. So the reason why I say that cover crops are important and we need to have more diversity on our crops, lands, and everything, nothing is fertilized this fence row, right? Or then maybe fertilizer had slung out from that spreader and hit that fence row a little bit, but you still have plants up there, grasses and different broadleafs that are taking up those nutrients. Granted, they're not being removed, but they die out, replenish that soil, and go again. So our biological activity is through the roof here because we consistently have photosynthesis feeding those microbes in that soil. The phosphorus and potassium numbers here through the roof. Our nitrogen numbers, organic nitrogen, is through the roof. I mean, 77 pounds of potential nitrogen credit. If we were just to rely on a nitrate test alone, we missed half of the nitrogen. So I use these tests to help farmers identify where we can really save some fertilizer and where we need to put our money, but also to understand what's the biology actually doing for us here. And I love taking a fence row to a field scenario and comparing the two to understand that once we build the biological aspect and we got this thing really ramped up and cooking, we got to keep it going because it's got all the opportunity to supply us a copious amount of nutrients to feed our crops without having to spend a lot of money to feed our crops.
David, you got
So
1.5 minutes.
Okay. So this is a PLFA test. This is another biological test. This test costs about $90. This is giving us, any test gives us a big overview on the kind of 30,000 foot view of biology. It doesn't really break down what species are in there. This test is really good to look at what functional diversity of different species that we have in there, to understand how things are functioning and breaking down and feeding that plant. Real quick, these two tests, the PLFA and the Haney test, traditionally we do soil tests on grids. This would be representing a 2.5 acre grid. So each one of these points are 330 foot from each other. So a 330 box by 330 foot box represents 2.5 acres. I see that there's more variability in a 2.5 acre grid than there is in the entire field. And plus with the cost of a Haney test being about $60 and the PLFA at 90, you can't afford to do that on 2.5 acres. So what I recommend is I actually do it either on a composite or I do it on a zone basis, like on this map here, where I take a look at the slope, the elevation, where water flows, bare soil imagery over a historical time period to identify where the true variability is in that field. And then I go sample as a composite within those zones. So the red areas all get sampled together, the green areas, the yellow areas, they all get sampled separately, but together to understand about where that variability truly is. and to make management decisions off of that. It gives me a huge opportunity to see what that field can actually do and provide to us beyond just looking at the chemical aspect of that soil. So with that, I'll end it and ask for any questions.
David, thank you so much. That was a comprehensive tour. And the reason we wanted to include this question of soil testing in this section about leasing and the arrangement is I think it's really important for landowners to trust but verify whether the farmer they have is actually building the assets of their soil, and because that soil is an asset, and if you deplete the asset and don't take care of it, you get something that's not productive, and that's not good for you and your profitability and your values. But with these tests,
Yeah.
David, how often would you say that these kind of tests should be done? And what happens if your farmer doesn't know these kind of the Haney and PLSA tests? How do you get good analysis of them?
Yeah, so I'll be honest, is that virtually very few agronomists know how to analyze either one of those tests. Um, they are new. It is something that a lot of people aren't trained in, and there's not kind of a rule book on how to use these tests. I take these tests every other year as far as the Haney test. The PLFA, I'll do that once every 3 to 5 years. I just I just want to use that kind of as a trend. Oftentimes for the PLFA, I'll just do a complete composite of entire field. Excuse me, instead of that zone basis, just because of the cost, but also the biology, every inch changes in that field. So basically, we're just kind of looking at the PLFA to say, okay, what's the trend going? How are we moving with our management? A couple other tests I didn't mention. Well, in the Haney test, I use every other year with those zones because I'm trying to manage nutrients with it, but also see how we're changing that soil. A couple other tests that a guy could take. Simple infield, you could drive a 3-inch ring that's 6 inches deep, drive it 3 inches into the ground, get a 16-ounce bottle of water, pour water into that, and see how long does it take water to infiltrate into that soil. That'll kind of give you an idea of how well your soils are aggregated to understand when you get that inch of rain, can you actually infiltrate an inch, or does it sit there for an hour or two before you finally just give up and you've only infiltrated a quarter of an inch? That's kind of a good indicator of how biologically active your soils are, how collapsed your soil aggregates are. You could also dig up some soil clods and dry them out, air dry them out for a couple days, and then suspend them into a cup of water that has some chicken wire in it, basically, that would hold that clod of soil, to understand and see how that soil either holds together or just slakes apart. If it falls apart, again, as that water goes into that soil and it falls apart, it's just saying that you don't have really good aggregate stability. Biological function in that soil probably isn't really that good. Those are simple tests that a person can do on their tailgates. That's free.
Yeah, great. Just curious, out there with landowners who are in our session, are any of you using soil testing just to kind of track the progress of your soil, or is that just something that your farmer takes care of? Be interested in the chat. And any questions now for David, Silas, or Rachel about anything that you've heard today? Okay. Let's see, I'm trying to think if there's any other questions. Do any of our panelists have any questions for each other? You guys have all covered some interesting things. Let's see, we have a chat. You see, one landowner said, "We see the soil test results and the farmer manages or coordinates." That makes a lot of sense. That makes a lot of sense.
Again, most of those are based on just making sure we have good fertility values.
Yeah.
And while that's important, I think there's other aspects of our soils that we really need to look at. We buy an acre of land or rent an acre of land that's representing 2 million pounds of topsoil in the top 6 inches that we're sampling for. So we really want to make sure that our soils are functional.
Yep. So in this, I guess this goes to leasing. Who would normally pay for the cost of the soil testing, David? Would that be farmer, or could that be built into the lease, or what would you suggest?
Yeah, so I actually I work directly with the farmers generally.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I don't I guess I shouldn't say that. I do have a couple that I work both with the farmer and the landowner as a shared interest. Um,
Hmm.
but the landowner has an interest in moving their farm down a more regenerative pathway, and they're willing to cover some of the cost of this test to help the farmer understand where their soils are doing, where they started and where they're going, and how to improve their soils over time.
Got it. Great. All right. I think we actually had someone here. Shannon was saying, I already mentioned that should we see the soil test results and the farmer manages and coordinates. And she said, when I visit, I plan to do some water tests myself. That's awesome. That's awesome to hear. Any last thoughts? Rachel, any last thoughts before we close up? Anything you've
Oh,
heard?
very interesting.
Good deal. Salas, any last thoughts?
No, I think the other presenters here feel like a wealth of knowledge. David, I'm surprised by I was not aware of just like the small percentage of was it fertilizer or the nutrients in general that actually become available to the crop.
Yeah,
That feels pretty astounding. And so
absolutely.
everybody's over fertilizer, or it's a lot of
If you start looking at the on Facebook, there's a group called the Lobe Rangers. It's up in the Des Moines watershed, um, and they start talking about a lot of these issues with fertilizing on land and how much is actually entering into that watershed. And they've thrown out some outstanding numbers. They're very good to watch. Zach Smith is one of the guys on there. Would recommend a lot of people look into that. And somebody had mentioned about water testing, and we talk about soil testing and doing these in-field soil tests with um, the slate demos and things like that. But also, if you have irrigation, it is really important to do water testing on that irrigation water because the nutrients, the carbonates, bicarbonates that are in that water that we're essentially keeping our crops alive with could be tying up nutrients in the soil as well. So that can become a challenge um, to getting nutrients into the crop.
Great. While we are closing up, Jeannie, do you mind sharing the poll? We're asking everyone, all the attendees, if you could quickly go through these poll results, it would be really helpful to us in terms of knowing whether this was useful to you. And it also helps with our funders showing that we're doing impactful work. So we'd appreciate your time. There's actually a few questions at the bottom for any service providers that are on the call who might hopefully be here to learn some things about things that they can share with farmland donors they work with. So again, if you could do this, it'd be awesome. I've just really enjoyed it. I really appreciate the expertise that each of you have brought. I think we're entering kind of like a new frontier zone where there's been a traditional way of kind of measuring whether farmland management is doing what we want, which is just productivity. Are we getting good crops? But I think with the things that David has been talking about with soil biology, there's like a new like we were playing three-dimensional chess, now we're playing four-dimensional chess. And what's happening with the soil microbes matters a lot. And I think it's something that hopefully farmland donors will find the resources they need, like you in the audience, so that you can better understand the true health of your soil, so that you can make really good decisions, long-term decisions for your land. Thank you to everyone who has filled out the poll already. If there's any last people who could do that, that would be great. I just want to thank so much David, Rachel, and Silas for putting special thought into this and customizing your presentation for this crowd. And just thank you everyone who attended. We hope that you'll come to session number 5 next week. Everyone, thank you so much. Have a great day. If you have a few more questions, we'd be happy to talk to you.